Chapter 1, verse 1. V'ela shmos b'nei Yisrael haba'im Mitzrayma. These are the names of the sons of Israel coming down to Egypt. Eis Yaakov Yishuvei Sobo. Uh, they came with Yaakov, each one with their household, and we start listing off all the names. This is, then in verse 5, it says there were 70 of them, and counting Yosef in Egypt. Now verse 6, it says Yosef and all his brothers died. And verse 7, the Jewish people were fruitful and multiplied and became very large. And the land of Egypt was filled with them. If I asked you, what is the new information that you see in these first 7 verses? I think it's very fair to say that the 7th verse is the first verse conveying something new. It's very strange when you think about it. First of all, the Torah is normally not in the business of repeating things it already told me. It told me we knew all of this in the last parsha, actually, or maybe even the penultimate parsha of Sefer Bereshis. We learned some of this. This was all pretty clear. Maybe verse 6. There, I guess verse 6. There's a new drop there, whatever. But why does the Torah feel the need to review this fact, and more so? What's the book of Shmos about? The book of Shmos is not about Yosef. The book of Shmos is not about his brothers. The book of Shmos is about the following generations and the experience in Egypt once things started going downhill. So it's more than redundant. It seems irrelevant to this chapter of the story. That's just a very striking thing. Let's see the Ramban on Pasuk Aleph. Tam ve'ela Shmos. Ki akasav yirtza limnos inyan hagalos me'es ridatam lemitzrayim. So fascinating statement from the Ramban. The Torah is telling us if we begin to look at the exile from the time that things started going downhill for the Jews in Egypt, that's not correct. The correct perspective is to view the Egypt experience from the beginning of the Jews' descent to Egypt. Ki az galu berosh golim kasher pirashti. They came in a very exalted way down to Egypt. Says the Ramban, the Torah is telling us, if the Torah is telling us that I was wrong. I said the beginning of the story is once things started getting difficult. Wrong. The beginning of the story is when they went down to Egypt. And therefore the Torah goes back to what we already know. Shumi pasuk v'chol zaro hevi to Mitzrayma. V'sham kasubach raviyel shmos b'nei Yisrael haboim Mitzrayma. So really interesting. The Ramban says the Torah is clearly hooking in to the point near the end of Sefer Bereshis that segues to this story in connecting this story to the Jewish people's descent. So there's a pasuk near the end of Sefer Bereshis that says, or the set of pasukim that begins with, these are the names of the Jewish people who came down to Egypt. So now we're making a point here. We're not telling you something you didn't know, but we're giving you a perspective you might not have had. An interesting thing. It's true, these are different books, but this is a continuous story. Now, we're not going to go through all the families like we did in Bereshis when it went through this descent into Egypt, but at least to say the names of the Shvatim, that we're doing. And we kind of, and then we sort of give the executive summary by saying, that there were 70 of the Jewish people there in Egypt at the beginning. I don't know if this is exactly the intent or not, but just the way it hits me when we're saying this is we have a way of putting things into different columns in our minds. There are good things and bad things, and in some vague sense, we believe they all come from God, but it's sort of like different realms. And there's something very powerful here that they were saved. They weren't going to starve. They were going to go down to Egypt, and they had connections in Egypt. And their brother was practically in charge of Egypt. There's a very striking thing that at that moment it looked wonderful, and that fundamentally connects to the terrible story we see in this week's parsha. And by the way, the terrible story we see in this week's parsha connects to the wonderful redemption we're going to see a few parshios from now. And it's all connected. And what it seems to speak to is we should never get too high or too low. I want to continue with this Ramban, but we'll skip. In mine, it's the next paragraph that we're skipping. It's about 8 lines or so, picking up with Rabbi Avram. So you could imagine this is a fair question, just that other Mefarshim will address. Why is the Torah starting the way it does in Parsha Shmos? So now he cites the Ibn Ezra. Rabbi Avram, Omar, Ki bavur sheizkir b'sof hasipor harishon ki ra Yosef livnei beno shilei shim. Right at the end of Parshas Vayechi, it talks about the fact that Yosef saw a third generation come from him. In other words, he lived to see the third generation. His kier, kigam echav beridatam hayu ma'atim ufarav v'ravu. So the Ibn Ezra says, you know what? The Torah is telling us that that's similar for the other brothers as well. Maybe not exactly the way it happened for Yosef, but the point is they came down to Egypt as a relatively small group, and they became fruitful and multiplied. The Ramban says, "Ve'inenu nachon." I don't think that's the pshat, but he cites the Ibn Ezra. Moving on. Rashi, because of Rashi, says, "Afo pisha manon b'chayayim, chazor manon achar misasam b'shmosam." A very famous Rashi that even though they were listed in their lifetime when they went down to Egypt, the Torah relists them at this point, after they've already died, lo diachibasam, to indicate God's affection for them. Shenim shalu lakochavim, that they are compared to stars. Shemot b'mispar umachnisan b'mispar, that God brings them out to the sky with a specific number, and he knows what the number is, and then he brings them back with a specific number. Shneimar, as it says in the pasuk, hamotzi b'mispar tzva'am l'chulam b'shem yikra, that God brings out the legions of the stars with a specific number, and he calls to each of them by name. Says the Ramban, ve'elu divrei Haggadah. This is a medrash. Ve'im dvarim shal emes be'inyan achibo v'shakadosh baruch hu m'chaban v'chof shmos tadir. He says, I definitely buy the concept that God has great affection for the Jewish people, and that's why we see in various places in the Chumash names are repeated and recounted, etc., etc. But if you want to know why this parsha is being connected to the parshios at the end of Sefer Bereshis, it's not because of this medrash, says the Ramban. The pshat is what I'm saying. It's to show that the story fundamentally connects. I just want to highlight something else the Ramban just mentioned in passing here. The very first word of Sefer Shmos is interesting. It says ve'ela, and these are the names. So the vav is fundamentally a connector to the previous story. So it just goes back to highlight the point of the Ramban. Okay, so those are 3 explanations as to why the Torah goes through this at the beginning. I just want to share with you a 4th before we go on, and that is the Sforno. Sforno on Pasuk Aleph, V'yela Shmos, Eile Haniskarim Bekan Hayru'uyim Li Vada B'Shem. The people mentioned here were fit to be referred to by name. Ki kol echad mehem roy lios nechshav ish al shmo hamora al tzuras ha'ishias. Says the Sforno, it's not a small thing to be mentioned in the Torah, and all of these people who are mentioned here, there's an explanation given for their name when they're named, and these are the names of these people, meaning each and every one of them lived up to the name that they received. These people, each and every one of them, each and every one of the sons of Yaakov, were lights during their lives. And that generation did not go on to bad things. But they didn't make the pious of Israel like they used to. And when it comes to the children of Yaakov, they're all worthy of being named in the Torah. And then when it goes on to the next generation, it's not that there weren't great people in the next generation. There's always great people, but it wasn't the same plane, and it wasn't the same level. I don't even remember or know if the Sforno says a similar thing on the later pasuk, but it's actually noted by others. Maybe the Sforno also, for all I know. When the Torah talks about Moshe's parents, it doesn't even refer to them by name. Vayelech ish mi beis Levi vayikach es bas Levi. We figure out later on what their names were for other psukim in the Torah, but it seems like a very stark contrast to listing all the names here, and that seems to fit in with what the Sforno is talking about. I repeat, that's not intended as a criticism of the next generation. It's more an observation of the greatness of the previous generation and the reality that things did change once the previous generation had died. Okay, moving on to verse 8. Vayakam melech chadash al Mitzrayim, a new king rose up on Egypt. Asher lo yadas Yosef, that didn't know Yosef. Famous Rashi over here. It could mean either that it just was a new king in town, didn't have a relationship with Yosef, or he acted like he didn't know Yosef. A very, very, very striking idea that he wasn't interested in Yosef. Verse 9, Vayomer el Amo. So Yosef's dead, by the way, but the point is he didn't remember Yosef. And Paro said to his nation, Yinei am b'nei Israel rav v'yatzum mimenu. Behold, the nation of Israel are greater in number than us. Verse 10, Hava nischak malo. Let's be smart about them. Pen your bet, lest they become great. For all we know, if we ever have a war, maybe the Jews will betray us. I think there's so much in this parsha that speaks to the Jewish saga through the generations about dealing with other nations. So, it's one of these things that the Egyptians look at the Jews and they say they're not really one of us. And if we have political difficulties, they might turn on us on a dime. Where are their loyalties really? Right? We know that song. V'nosaf gamu al soneinu, and they will join up with our enemies. V'nocham banu, and they'll fight against us. V'alam in aretz, and they'll rise up from the land. So we better come up with a plan. Now, verse 11, Vayasimu olav sarei misim. So Paro now places taskmasters on the Jews, l'man anoso b'siflo sum, to afflict the Jewish people. And presumably the idea is that we're going to work them really hard and they won't be able to multiply anymore, or certainly not at the same rate. And they built cities for Paro. And now verse 12, and yet the harder they were worked, the more they grew in number. And the Egyptians became more and more agitated by the Jewish people. There's a fascinating Ramban over here. We're not going to see all of it today, but I just want to get started on it. Ramban on Pasuk Yud, Hava nischak malo. What a funny thing to say. You're worried. You're the most powerful person in the land, and you're worried about a group. And you say to your advisors, let's come up with a sly plan. I mean, that's what he said. Let's be smart about this. Why don't you just hit them or kill them or exile them or something? Just do something. If you're so scared about them. Says the Ramban, Lo ra Paro v'chachma yoatzav lahakosam. Paro and his advisors did not think it wise to strike the Jews. Kitia begida gedola lahakos chinam. Ha'am asher bo be'eretz b'mitzvah samelech harishon. That would be poor political play. It would not look good. The newspapers would have a heyday on Paro. Here it is. There's a king who invites a group to come live in our land, and now out of the blue they start attacking them. The Egyptians, the home government, starts attacking the nation invited to join them. How could that be? That's so treacherous. V'gam am haaretz lo yitnu reshus lamelech lasos chamas kazeh. The Egyptian society wouldn't stand for it. The rank and file of Egypt would object. Because this is what's happening here. Look at verse 9. Vayomer el amo. Paro said to his people, doesn't even say his advisors. He said his people, which implies that Paro was talking among the people. I don't know what to do with these Jews. But it's clear that that it's important to him what the people on the streets say. By the way, the whole observation here is the Jewish people are a big nation. They might fight back. It might be complicated. Well, Amar Shiyasu Derech Chachma. So Paro's idea is let's be smart. Shlo Yargishu Yisrael Ki Be'eva Yasu V'hem. That the Jewish people won't realize that we're treating them with enmity. V'lochein Hitil Bohem Mas. We like you very much. We think the Jews are great. We just need you to chip in with the building plan. It's not unheard of that people who are newcomers to a land have to pay their way, so to say. So the payment wasn't with taxes, or it was a different type of tax. It was a bodily tax. It wasn't a money tax. He says, for those learning in the Navi class, that's what happened with Shlomo. I don't think we've gotten up to that yet. I think we're almost there. But okay, so we probably will continue with this Ramban tomorrow because it's fascinating. But it's just interesting to see. It's interesting to see how much of this, if you understand it like the Ramban, is really kind of foreshadowing, as we've seen in other things early in Bereshis, for later problems that the Jewish people have, and political issues, etc. So we began that Ramban, and we discussed the Ramban and the Ibn Ezra and Rashi as to why the Torah seems to just be reviewing things at the beginning of this week's parsha.